when the HOA president destroyed my cherished creek, claiming it devalued homes. I found a perfectly legal way to block his entire street with 5 semi-trucks. How far would this power-hungry man go when he realized he'd messed with the wrong homeowner? The sound of heavy machinery jolted me awake. I rushed to my window and couldn't believe my eyes. Workers in yellow vests were digging up my beloved creek. I threw on clothes and sprinted outside, heart pounding against my ribs. "Stop! What are you doing?" I shouted, waving my arms frantically. The foreman glanced at his clipboard. "HOA orders. This waterway is being redirected and covered." I stood there in shock, watching as excavators tore through the delicate ecosystem where my kids had spent countless summer afternoons catching tadpoles and building tiny leaf boats. That creek had been the reason I bought this house in Pine Haven Meadows 10 years ago. "There must be some mistake," I insisted. "Nobody told me about this." The foreman shrugged. "Take it up with Mr. Reynolds. We're just doing what we're paid for." James Reynolds, of course, the new HOA president who moved in 6 months ago and immediately started complaining about everything. My garden gnomes, the color of my mailbox, even the bird feeders I hung in my oak tree. Now he was destroying my creek? I marched straight to his oversized colonial house with its perfect lawn and rang the doorbell repeatedly. When he finally answered, his face showed no surprise. "Ah, I see you've noticed our neighborhood improvement project," he said with a smug smile. "Improvement? You're destroying a natural habitat. Why wasn't I notified?" My voice shook with anger. Reynolds straightened his golf polo. "The notice was in last month's HOA newsletter. Page 4, I believe. The board voted unanimously that the unchecked waterway creates an unkempt appearance that devalues surrounding properties." "That's ridiculous. That creek has been there longer than this neighborhood." Nevertheless, RCC and RS clearly state that the HOA has authority over all exterior appearances. The rocks and landscaping will look much more controlled. He emphasized the last word like it was something precious. I spent the entire day making frantic calls to other board members, to the county environmental office, even to a lawyer friend. No one could help immediately. By sunset, my beautiful creek had been partially diverted through ugly concrete channels and covered with decorative stone where it passed behind the homes of Reynolds and his friends on the board. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the countless times my daughter Emma had squealed with delight finding a colorful crawfish, or how my son Tyler had learned to skip stones on the wider bends. The creek wasn't just water. It was our family's memories. The next morning, I drove to the county records office as soon as it opened. I needed to understand the property lines, the HOA's actual authority, anything that might help me fight back. The clerk, an older woman named Doris, seemed sympathetic to my situation. "HOAs think they're little kingdoms," she muttered, helping me access digital maps of our subdivision. "But they don't always know the whole story." 4 hours, I pored over property records, plat maps, and the original development plans for Pine Haven Meadows. Most of it confirmed what Reynolds had said. The HOA did have broad authority over exterior appearances. But then I found something interesting in the emergency access easements. "Doris, what does this notation mean?" I pointed to a line on the map. She adjusted her glasses. "That's interesting. According to this, the emergency access road that runs behind the eastern lots wasn't fully dedicated to the township. Parts of it belong to the adjoining lot owners." My pulse quickened. "So the road behind my house partially belongs to you," she confirmed. "It's an easement, so you can't block emergency vehicles, but otherwise, it's your property to the center line." I thanked her profusely and left with copies of everything. As I drove home, an idea began forming. That emergency access road was rarely used for its intended purpose, but Reynolds and his board allies all lived on that street and used it as their primary entrance. A private shortcut that saved them from driving around the main neighborhood loop. At home, I called my cousin Derek, who owned a small trucking company. "Hey, how badly do you need garage space for your semis this week?" I asked. "Why? What are you planning?" He sounded suspicious but interested. "A lesson in property rights," I replied. "How many trucks can you spare for a few days?" Derek laughed. For you, after that time you helped me move on Christmas Eve, I've got 5 rigs between halls right now. Perfect. We made arrangements for early the next morning, and I spent the evening carefully measuring my property line along the emergency access road, marking exactly where I could legally park vehicles without blocking actual emergency access. That night, I slept better than I had in days. I didn't know if my plan would get my creek restored, but at least Reynolds would understand what it felt like to have someone mess with your daily life. As dawn broke, I met Derek and his drivers at the neighborhood entrance. They followed me to the access road, where I directed them to park 5 massive semi-trucks in a staggered formation. Each truck was legally parked on my portion of the easement, leaving just enough room for a single car to slowly weave through, technically accessible for emergency vehicles, but a major headache for regular traffic. I was making coffee when my phone rang. Reynolds' name flashed on the screen. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, not waiting for me to say hello. "Exercising my property rights," I replied calmly. "According to county records, I own part of that access road. I'm simply allowing my cousin to park his commercial vehicles on my property. This is clearly retaliation. I can't even get my car out without scratching it." "I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps you could use the main neighborhood entrance like everyone else?" I believe the notice about this parking arrangement was on page 4 of my personal newsletter. "Did you not receive it?" The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice cold. "The board will take action." "I look forward to discussing it," I replied before hanging up. Within an hour, my doorbell was ringing nonstop as angry neighbors demanded I move the trucks. I politely explained the situation to each one, showing them the property records and reminding them how I'd received no warning before my creek was destroyed. Some stormed off, but a few actually listened, especially when I mentioned the creek was protected under county watershed regulations. By noon, Reynolds had called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening. Phase 1 of my plan was working perfectly. Now I needed to prepare for Phase 2. What would happen when I walked into that meeting room and faced the entire angry board? Would my property records be enough, or had I just started a neighborhood war I couldn't win? The community center buzzed with angry voices as I walked in for the emergency HOA meeting. Reynolds had clearly rallied his supporters. Nearly 50 residents packed the room, many shooting daggers at me with their eyes. I clutched my folder of documents tightly, suddenly questioning if I'd gone too far. "There he is," someone shouted. "The man blocking our road." Reynolds stood at the front, his face a mask of righteous indignation. The gavel banged loudly, calling for order. "This emergency meeting will come to order," Reynolds announced. "We're here to address a serious violation of community standards and good faith neighborly conduct." I took a seat in the back row, trying to ignore the whispers around me. Reynolds launched into a dramatic speech about how my dangerous and petty act of revenge was endangering the community by potentially blocking emergency vehicles. When he finally paused for breath, I raised my hand. "May I respond to these allegations?" "You'll get your turn," he snapped. "First, I'd like to hear from other affected residents." For 20 painful minutes, I listened as my neighbors complained about the inconvenience. Elaine Walker, Reynolds' biggest supporter on the board, described how she nearly scratched her Mercedes trying to navigate between 2 trucks. Thomas Quinn, a developer who recently joined the board, warned that property values would plummet if this kind of vigilante behavior was tolerated. Finally, Reynolds turned to me with a smirk. "Now, would you care to explain yourself before we vote on the appropriate penalties?" I stood and walked to the front, feeling every eye in the room on me. With deliberate calm, I opened my folder and placed my documents on the table. 3 days ago, without any meaningful notice to me, the HOA destroyed a natural waterway on my property that's been there for generations. My children grew up playing in that creek. It was a sanctuary for local wildlife, and it was eliminated because Mr. Reynolds decided it looked unkempt. I turned to face the room. "How many of you received actual notice that the creek was being removed? A real notice, not a buried mention in a newsletter nobody reads." A few people shifted uncomfortably. No hands went up. I went to the county records office and discovered something interesting. I continued, sliding the property maps across the table. The emergency access road that runs behind our houses isn't fully HOA property. Each homeowner owns the portion behind their lot to the center line. I'm simply exercising my property rights by allowing vehicles to park there, just as the HOA exercised its perceived rights on my creek. Reynolds' face darkened. This is clearly retaliatory and, furthermore, I interrupted, pulling out another document. I contacted the county environmental office. That creek is part of a protected watershed. Its diversion without proper permits is actually illegal. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was news to many of them. That's preposterous, Reynolds sputtered. The board reviewed all necessary regulations. From the middle of the room, someone stood up. I recognized Trevor Mitchell, a retired environmental engineer who kept to himself. I'd barely spoken to him in the 5 years he'd lived here. Actually, Trevor said, he's right. I've been documenting the creek's wildlife for years as part of a county biodiversity study. What the HOA did violated at least 3 environmental protections. Reynolds looked stunned. Why wasn't the board informed of this study? I sent a detailed letter when you proposed beautification 6 months ago, Trevor replied. It was dismissed without discussion. The mood in the room was shifting. I could feel it. People were glancing at each other, at Reynolds, at me. Elaine Walker recovered first. This doesn't change the fact that those trucks are a hazard and an eyesore. We need to vote to have them removed immediately and fine this troublemaker. Before you vote, I said calmly, you should know I've already filed a formal complaint with County Environmental Services. They're sending inspectors tomorrow morning. The fines for unauthorized watershed disruption start at $10,000 per day. A shocked silence fell over the room. Reynolds' face had gone from red to white. Who would pay those fines? Someone asked nervously. The HOA, I replied, meaning all of us through special assessments. Unless, of course, we could reach a more reasonable solution. Reynolds found his voice. This is blackmail. This is negotiation. I corrected. The trucks will be moved as soon as a plan is approved to restore my creek to its natural state. And going forward, any major changes affecting individual properties will require direct notification and consent from the homeowners involved. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Trevor Mitchell stepped forward. I move that we create an environmental review committee to develop a creek restoration plan, effective immediately. I second, called another voice, Mrs. Abernathy, whose grandchildren often played in the creek when visiting. Reynolds looked around desperately, but he was losing control of the room. More residents were nodding, talking amongst themselves. Fine, he finally said through gritted teeth. We'll form a committee, but those trucks need to be moved now, not after some lengthy review process. 3 days, I countered. The same amount of time I had to watch my creek being destroyed. The committee presents a preliminary plan in 3 days, the trucks move, and then we work together on proper implementation. Before Reynolds could object, Trevor called for a vote. The majority raised their hands in favor of my proposal. As the meeting broke up, people approached me with mixed reactions. Some were supportive, others still angry but resigned. Trevor handed me his card. That took courage, he said quietly. I've been wanting to challenge Reynolds' autocratic style for months but didn't want to rock the boat. I'd be honored to chair the environmental committee. I felt a mix of relief and wariness. I'd won this round, but Reynolds wasn't the type to surrender easily. As if reading my thoughts, he approached as the room emptied. You think you're clever, he said, voice low, but you've made a powerful enemy today. I built this community. I have friends in the township, in the county offices. Your little creek won't be the only thing that gets buried. He stalked away before I could respond. His threat hung in the air, chilling my moment of victory. What had I started? And how far would Reynolds go to maintain his control over Pine Haven Meadows? Reynolds slammed his gavel so hard I thought the table might crack. This emergency meeting of Pine Haven Meadows Homeowners Association will come to order. My heart raced as I clutched my folder of documents. The community center buzzed with angry voices. Most neighbors had never attended an HOA meeting before, but my semi-trucks had certainly gotten their attention. People stood against walls and sat cross-legged on the floor since all 30 chairs were taken. "Before we begin," Reynolds said through gritted teeth, "I want to address the outrageous situation blocking our emergency access road. 5 commercial vehicles have made it nearly impossible for residents to reach their homes." Elaine Walker shot to her feet, her designer scarf fluttering. "My daughter was late to her dance recital. We had to walk 4 blocks in the rain because we couldn't get our car out." Her finger jabbed the air in my direction. "This is harassment, plain and simple." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. I took a deep breath, staying seated while scanning the room. Many faces showed anger, but others looked curious. Reynolds pointed at me. "You have 1 minute to explain yourself before we vote on emergency removal measures and appropriate fines." I stood slowly, walking to the front with my folder. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I understand everyone's frustration. I felt the same way last week when crews showed up without warning to destroy the creek on my property." "That was a board-approved beautification project," Reynolds interrupted. "Actually," I said, spreading my documents on the table, "I've brought copies of my property deed, survey maps, and the county waterway protection statutes." I handed stacks to people in the front row to pass around. "The creek that was filled in isn't just on my land. It's a protected natural waterway. No permits were filed with the environmental office." Reynolds' face flushed red. "That's irrelevant to your trucks blocking." "As for the trucks," I continued calmly, sliding more papers across the table, "they're parked on a section of the access road that, according to township records, falls partially on my property line. I've highlighted the relevant sections. They're legally parked with proper permits." A tall woman in the back whistled. Someone else muttered, "Wow, they really picked the wrong person to mess with." Reynolds snatched the papers. "This doesn't give you the right to block an emergency access route." "Actually," came a new voice from the back, "according to Pine Haven bylaws, emergency access must be maintained at a minimum width of 12 feet. I measured this morning. Even with the trucks, there's still 14 feet of clearance." People turned to see Trevor Mitchell walking toward the front. Trevor had lived in Pine Haven for 15 years but rarely spoke at meetings. He was a retired civil engineer who mostly kept to himself, tending his immaculate garden. "I've been documenting the board's actions for some time," Trevor said, placing his own thick folder on the table, "including 7 separate bylaw violations in the past year alone." Reynolds' expression darkened. "This meeting isn't about past board actions." "Perhaps it should be," Trevor replied, flipping his folder open. "Especially the illegal diversion of a protected waterway without environmental permits. That carries potential criminal penalties under state law." The room erupted. Mrs. Gonzalez from 2 streets over stood up. "My basement flooded last week for the first time in 20 years. Right after that creek work. My well water turned brown," called someone else. Reynolds banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order. This is absurd." Elaine rushed to his defense. "James has done nothing but try to maintain our property values. That nasty ditch was an eyesore." Trevor pulled out a large aerial map. "That nasty ditch is part of Willow Creek, which feeds into the county reservoir. It's protected under the Clean Water Act." I hadn't known this detail. My research had focused on property lines, not environmental regulations. I glanced at Trevor with newfound respect. Furthermore, Trevor continued, "I've documented every HOA meeting for the past 5 years. No vote was ever taken on creek modification. The minutes show no discussion of this project whatsoever." Reynolds' face had gone from red to white. He whispered something to Elaine, who shook her head frantically. A younger homeowner, Sarah Jensen, raised her hand. "I'd like to make a motion. Before any action is taken on the truck situation, I move we investigate the creek modification project and determine if proper procedures were followed." "Second," called several voices. Reynolds looked trapped. By HOA rules, he had to allow the vote. All in favor? Sarah asked. Nearly every hand went up. Why don't we adjourn for today? Trevor suggested calmly. Give everyone time to review these documents. And perhaps our president should contact the county environmental office himself before they contact him. Reynolds glared at me with such hatred I felt a chill. This meeting is adjourned, he muttered, gathering his papers hastily. As people filed out, many stopped to examine my documents more closely. Trevor approached with a small group of homeowners I didn't recognize. I'm impressed with your research, he said, extending his hand. I've been building a case against Reynolds for months, but needed a catalyst to bring it forward. Why? I asked, shaking his hand. Because, Trevor lowered his voice. There's more going on here than a filled-in creek. Much more. Have you looked at the HOA financial records lately? Or noticed which homes got new roofs last year after the hailstorm, and which didn't? Reynolds isn't just bending rules, he's breaking laws. I stared at him, realizing this neighborhood conflict had just grown much larger than my personal battle. We should talk, said one of the women with Trevor. I'm on the county water board. If that creek is what Trevor thinks it is, we might be looking at serious environmental violations. As we exchanged numbers, I noticed Reynolds watching us from across the room, his cell phone pressed to his ear. His expression made my skin crawl. What had I stumbled into? This started as a fight over my peaceful creek, but now felt like something far more dangerous. How deep did this corruption go, and what would Reynolds do to keep it hidden? County Environmental Inspector Maria Ramirez pulled her government-issued SUV alongside my driveway at exactly 9 a.m. 2 more official vehicles followed. The neighbors peeked through windows as uniformed inspectors spread across my backyard with measuring equipment and sample collection kits. The creek bed appears to have been filled with non-permeable material, Maria noted, scraping at the decorative rocks. This violates Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Did anyone file environmental impact statements before this work began? Not that I'm aware of, I replied. The HOA president ordered it done. The fines start at $25,000 per day of violation, she said, taking photos, plus mandatory restoration costs. Trevor had joined us, bringing maps showing the creek's path through the neighborhood. It's part of the protected watershed, he explained to Maria. Feeds directly into Harmon Reservoir. That makes this a public water supply issue too, Maria frowned, typing notes into her tablet. We'll need to test for contaminants immediately. Reynolds' black Mercedes screeched to a halt at the curb. He stomped across my lawn, straightening his tie. What's going on here? You have no authority to bring government officials onto HOA property without board approval. Maria turned slowly. Mr. Reynolds? I'm Maria Ramirez, County Environmental Protection. This isn't HOA property according to our records. And we have full authority to investigate Clean Water Act violations without anyone's permission. There's been a misunderstanding, Reynolds backpedaled, his tone suddenly smoothing. Our landscaping project was fully approved by whom? Maria interrupted. We have no record of permits being filed. No environmental impact study. No water diversion application. Nothing. Reynolds glared at me. I need to speak with you. Privately. Anything you need to say can be said here, I replied. Reynolds stepped closer, lowering his voice. Move those trucks today or face consequences. This neighborhood has rules. So does the Clean Water Act, I countered. He stormed off, phone already pressed to his ear. I felt uneasy watching him go. He seems charming, Maria commented dryly. We'll need statements from both of you. This investigation could take weeks. After the inspectors left, Trevor and I compared notes over coffee on my patio. The creek had been beautiful here. A gentle burbling stream where deer drank at dawn and fireflies danced on summer nights. Now it was just ugly rocks and dirt. Reynolds moved fast after becoming president, Trevor explained. Changed bylaws to give the board more power. Raised dues. Started these beautification projects nobody asked for. But why target my creek specifically? I wondered. Trevor shrugged. Maybe because you're new. Less established relationships. Easier target. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Derek. Someone slashed all the truck tires. Filing police report now. I showed Trevor the message. Reynolds, he said immediately. He's getting desperate. We drove to the access road where Derek stood with 2 police officers beside the damaged trucks. All 20 tires had been cut to ribbons. This is vandalism and destruction of property, one officer said, taking notes. Any idea who might have done this? Before I could speak, Trevor pointed to a lamppost. There's a security camera. Neighborhood Watch installed them last year. The second officer checked the camera. It's working. We'll get the footage. No need, came a voice behind us. Mrs. Henderson, the 78-year-old who lived in the corner house, approached slowly with her iPad. I saw someone suspicious this morning and checked my doorbell camera. Already downloaded the video. She handed over her tablet. The footage clearly showed Reynolds circling the trucks at 3 a.m., knife in hand, systematically slashing each tire. Well, the first officer said, that makes our job easier. The police left to find Reynolds. Meanwhile, neighbors gathered around the trucks, drawn by the commotion. He really slashed all these tires? Sarah Jensen asked, shaking her head. That's insane. And expensive, Derek added. About $12,000 worth of damage. Trevor checked his watch. They should be at his house by now. As if on cue, my phone rang, an unknown number. I answered cautiously. This is Officer Patel with Pine Haven Police. Are you the homeowner who filed the vandalism report on Oakwood Drive? Yes, I confirmed. Sir, you may want to come to the station. There's been a development. Trevor drove me to the police station, where Officer Patel met us in the lobby. We went to arrest Mr. Reynolds for the vandalism, he explained. But when we arrived, he was shredding documents. Lots of documents. HOA records? Trevor guessed. Financial records, Officer Patel confirmed. When we questioned him, his story kept changing. We obtained a warrant to search the rest of his home and found something interesting. He led us to a conference room where financial ledgers and folders covered the table. These appear to be HOA financial records, Officer Patel explained. But they don't match the official records filed with the county. There are 2 sets of books. Trevor picked up a ledger, flipping pages. His eyebrows shot up. These show over $300,000 in maintenance contracts paid to a company called R&W Enterprises. That's not in the official HOA budget. Officer Patel nodded. R&W Enterprises is registered to Walter Reynolds, James Reynolds' brother. My mind reeled. He's been embezzling HOA funds? Appears that way, Officer Patel replied. And there's more. We found environmental study documents for your creek. They clearly state it's a protected waterway that can't be modified without permits. Reynolds had this information before ordering the work done. Why would he deliberately violate environmental laws? I wondered. Trevor was still examining documents. Look at this, he said, pointing to a map. The area where your creek flows connects to a 10-acre parcel outside our neighborhood. It's marked for future development. Officer Patel leaned closer. Reynolds' wife works for Sierra Development Corporation. They've been trying to build luxury condos there for years, but water access has been a problem. The pieces suddenly clicked. So by diverting my creek, he was helping clear the way for his wife's company's development project and possibly getting kickbacks, Trevor added. These maintenance contracts to his brother's company could be how they're laundering the money. A female officer entered the room. Sir, Reynolds is asking for a lawyer, and Mrs. Reynolds just arrived. She's demanding to know what's happening. Catherine Reynolds, always perfectly dressed, always perfectly composed, stood in the doorway looking anything but perfect now. Her mascara streaked down her face, her designer blouse half untucked. What has James done? She whispered, staring at the financial records spread across the table. Officer Patel gestured to a chair. Mrs. Reynolds, we have some questions about Sierra Development and their interest in the Pine Haven watershed. Catherine's face crumpled. I told him it wasn't worth it. I told him someone would notice eventually. The quiet neighborhood I'd moved to for peace had become the center of what now appeared to be criminal conspiracy involving environmental crimes, embezzlement, and who knew what else. As Catherine Reynolds began to outline a scheme more elaborate than any of us had imagined, I caught Trevor's eye across the table. His slight nod confirmed what I was thinking. This went far beyond my trucks or my creek. How many other lives had Reynolds ruined with his schemes? And who else in our quiet community was involved in this web of corruption? The emergency HOA meeting felt different this time. Instead of the usual 20 people, nearly 100 neighbors packed into the community center. Some stood against walls while others sat cross-legged on the floor. My heart pounded as Margaret Tanner tapped the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Margaret said, her voice honey-sweet as she adjusted her pearl necklace. With James Reynolds temporarily stepping aside due to his personal issues, I'll be serving as your acting HOA president. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Reynolds' arrest for vandalism and the discovery of financial irregularities had shocked our quiet community. I noticed several people glancing my way, some with sympathy, others with barely disguised anger. "Our first priority must be healing this community," Margaret continued, pausing to make eye contact with different sections of the audience. "Pine Haven Meadows has always been a premium neighborhood with excellent property values. We need to maintain our standards." I tensed, sensing what was coming. Starting with removing those eyesore trucks blocking our emergency access road and addressing unauthorized landscaping modifications. Her gaze locked on me. "The board will enforce all covenant violations equally." The crowd erupted in applause. My stomach dropped as I realized Reynolds might be gone. But his policies lived on. "The creek destruction was illegal," I called out, rising to my feet. "They diverted a natural waterway without permits." Margaret's smile never wavered. "We're looking into all proper procedures. Meanwhile, those trucks need to move within 48 hours, or we'll have them towed at owner expense." People nodded. I felt completely alone until someone touched my shoulder. "May I?" Trevor Mitchell asked quietly, gesturing toward the microphone. I nodded, grateful for any support. Trevor cleared his throat. "I've lived here 7 years and never spoke at meetings before last week. I regret that now." He opened a leather portfolio. "According to our bylaws, any environmental modification requiring permits must have 2/3 homeowner approval, not just board approval." Margaret's smile tightened. "That's not how we interpret. It's exactly what Section 12, Paragraph 8 states." Trevor interrupted, holding up the document. "I've contacted 3 homeowners who had similar water features filled in last year. We're forming a creek restoration group." 3 people stood up around the room: Sophia Patel, David Wilson, and elderly Mrs. Abernathy from the corner lot. "And we have enough votes to force a recall election of the entire board," Trevor finished. The room fell silent. Margaret's face flushed deep red. "This is outrageous. We're trying to maintain standards that keep your homes valuable. You destroyed my property without proper authority," I said, finding my voice. "The environmental officials are already investigating. Let's put it to a community vote and see what our neighbors really want." Mrs. Abernathy piped up, her voice shaky but determined. "My late husband and I bought here because of the beautiful natural setting. These water features are what made Pine Haven special. Now it looks like every other cookie-cutter development." Margaret slammed her gavel. "Fine. According to bylaws, we'll schedule a recall vote in 30 days. Until then, the current board remains in charge." She pointed at me. "And those trucks need to move." For the first time in weeks, I felt hope as several neighbors came up afterward to shake my hand. Trevor introduced me to the others in our newly formed coalition. "I'm an environmental engineer," Sophia explained. "What they did to your creek violates at least 3 watershed protection laws. And I'm a retired attorney," David added. "They messed with the wrong neighborhood." We agreed to meet the next evening at my house to plan our strategy. I went to bed that night feeling like I'd finally found allies in this fight. The next morning, I stepped outside to find an official-looking notice taped to my door. My hands trembled as I read, violation, unauthorized vehicles, fines accruing at $200 per day, eviction proceedings to begin after 30 days of non-compliance. When I called Trevor, he had received an identical notice, as had Sophia and Mrs. Abernathy. Only David had been spared. A pattern was emerging. Anyone who stood against the board was being targeted. Later that day, as I returned from grocery shopping, I spotted Margaret and 2 board members taking photos of my house from the street. When they saw me, they didn't even pretend to be doing anything else. Just documenting ongoing violations. Margaret called out sweetly. Oh, and you might want to trim those bushes. They're 2 inches above regulation height. That night, identical notes appeared on all our doors. Drop the recall or face eviction proceedings. This is your only warning. The paper had the HOA letterhead, but no signature. When Trevor called the HOA's legal firm to verify, they denied sending any such notices. Someone was trying to scare us. But who? We gathered in my living room as planned. Mrs. Abernathy brought homemade cookies while Sophia spread out property maps on my dining table. Look at this, Sophia said, pointing to blue lines running through our neighborhood. These are natural waterways that existed before development. Yours isn't just any creek. It's a headwater tributary that feeds into Riverside Lake. David adjusted his glasses. That makes it protected under state watershed laws. The developer would have needed special permits to build near it at all. So why is the board so determined to cover them up? Trevor wondered. Money, Mrs. Abernathy said simply. Something's not right about the finances. My Herbert used to be treasurer before he passed. He always said development companies were constantly trying to buy influence with the board. A knock at the door startled us. I opened it to find Catherine Reynolds, James' wife, standing nervously on my porch. May I come in? She asked quietly. There's something you all need to know. We stared in shock as Catherine placed a USB drive on my table. James isn't the mastermind here. He's just a pawn in something bigger. And I'm afraid you've kicked a hornet's nest. The battle had only just begun, and now I wondered if we were facing something much more dangerous than just a power-hungry HOA president. Catherine Reynolds' hands shook as she accepted the cup of tea I offered. The 5 of us watched her cautiously from around my living room. I never agreed with what James did to your creek, she said softly. But I kept quiet to protect my family. Now that he's facing charges, I can't stay silent anymore. She plugged the USB drive into my laptop. Dozens of files appeared, emails, contracts, and photographs. 3 years ago, Thomas Quinn of Quinn Development approached the board, Catherine explained, opening an email thread. His company wanted to build luxury townhomes on the empty land behind Pine Haven. There was just one problem. That land is a natural floodplain. Sophia leaned forward, which makes it nearly impossible to get building permits. Exactly, Catherine nodded. Unless the water could be diverted elsewhere. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. So they needed to eliminate all the creeks in our neighborhood to change the water flow. Quinn offered James and the other board members premium home upgrades in exchange for their help. Catherine continued, showing us photos of new kitchen renovations and swimming pools at board members' homes. Free improvements worth thousands of dollars. All they had to do was start targeting creek features as eyesores and safety hazards. Trevor whistled. That's straight-up bribery. Did you notice who got targeted first? Catherine asked. Homes along the natural drainage paths. Yours was one of the last remaining creeks. Mrs. Abernathy gasped. Mine was the first to go. They said it was attracting mosquitoes, but I never had that problem for 15 years. Because this was never about property values, David said grimly. It was about manipulating water flow to get building permits. I pulled out township maps I'd found at the county records office earlier that week. Look here. My creek isn't just any waterway. It's part of a protected watershed that supplies drinking water to 3 counties. Catherine nodded. Quinn knows that. That's why they're desperate to finish covering it before environmental officials catch on. Once it's done, it's harder to prove what was there. So what happens if they succeed? Trevor asked. Sophia's expression darkened. They build on a floodplain, make millions selling townhomes. Then when the inevitable flooding happens, those homeowners suffer while Quinn has already pocketed the profit. And our neighborhood could face serious drainage issues. I added. No wonder they're fighting so hard against us. Catherine pulled out one more document. The recall election is just the beginning. If you win, Quinn will lose millions. I found this draft lawsuit on James' computer. They're prepared to sue each of you personally if you continue. The room fell silent as we absorbed this threat. David broke the tension with a short laugh. Let them try. I've been a lawyer for 40 years. I welcome that fight. We need to take this public, Trevor suggested. The local news would love this story. And I can get the Environmental Protection Office involved, Sophia added. With this evidence, they'll have to act. Mrs. Abernathy squeezed Catherine's hand. Thank you for your bravery, dear. It couldn't have been easy to turn against your husband. Catherine wiped away a tear. James wasn't always like this. Money and power changed him. I've already filed for divorce. The next morning, I called local reporter Diane Fleming, who had covered environmental stories in the past. She arrived within hours, camera crew in tow. HOA allegedly accepting bribes to damage protected watershed. That's quite a headline, she said, reviewing our evidence. The story aired that evening. By morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors I'd never spoken to called offering support. Environmental groups pledged legal assistance. The county commissioner's office promised an immediate investigation. Margaret Tanner appeared at my door unannounced, her usual composure completely gone. What have you done? She hissed. Quinn Development is threatening to sue all of us. They say we guaranteed them those permits. You made illegal promises you couldn't keep, I replied calmly, and you damaged my property in the process. You don't understand what you're messing with. Her voice cracked with genuine fear. These people aren't just developers. They have connections, political influence. Before I could respond, a black SUV pulled up. Thomas Quinn himself stepped out. A tall man in an expensive suit with a smile that never reached his eyes. So this is the troublemaker, he said, looking me up and down. Let's talk privately about how we can resolve this situation to everyone's benefit. There's nothing to discuss, I answered, noticing several neighbors coming out of their homes, watching the confrontation. You tried to destroy a protected watershed for profit. Quinn's smile remained fixed. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous compensation package. New kitchen, bathroom remodel, even a pool. Whatever you want. I want my creek restored, and I want you to face consequences for attempting to damage a protected watershed. His expression hardened. Don't be stupid. Everyone has a price. Not everyone, Trevor called out, walking up my driveway with Sophia, David, and at least 20 other neighbors. And certainly not this community. Quinn looked around at the gathering crowd, his confidence visibly shaken. The recall election is tomorrow, I reminded him, and we've submitted all your evidence to the county prosecutor. I'd say your problems are just beginning. That night, an emergency town hall meeting was called. Nearly every homeowner attended. Catherine stood before them all and revealed everything. The bribes, the environmental damage, the backroom deals. I was complicit through my silence, she admitted. But I can't stand by anymore while this company threatens our neighborhood and our watershed. Thomas Quinn arrived with 3 attorneys, trying to intimidate us into silence. But something remarkable happened instead. One by one, neighbors stood to share their stories. How their own water features had been targeted. How they'd been bullied by the board. How they missed the natural beauty our neighborhood once had. Quinn tried to speak but was drowned out by boos. His attorneys whispered urgently in his ear as he scanned the hostile room. Without another word, they retreated through the side door. As the meeting ended, Margaret approached me with several other board members. We want to resign before the recall, she said quietly, and we'll testify about Quinn's offers if needed. I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. Help us fix what we broke, I told her. That's all I ever wanted. Tomorrow's election would decide the future of our neighborhood. But tonight, watching neighbors talking excitedly about creek restoration plans, I already felt like we'd won something precious. Our community had finally come together. The question now was whether Quinn Development would accept defeat gracefully, or if their promised retaliation was still to come. Voting day arrived with a buzz I hadn't felt in our neighborhood for years. Folks lined up outside the community center before the doors even opened. Some neighbors who never spoke to each other were now deep in conversation about watershed protection and property rights. "Never thought I'd see you here, Carol," I said to an elderly woman who rarely left her house. "When those trucks showed up, I started paying attention," she replied with a wink. "Nobody messes with our water." Inside the crowded room, tension hung heavy. Reynolds sat in the corner, arms crossed, whispering to his few remaining allies. Trevor stood confidently at the podium, explaining his vision for a more transparent HOA. When he invited me up to speak about the creek restoration plan, Reynolds jumped to his feet. "This man illegally blocked our road. He should be arrested, not elected," he shouted, pointing at me. The room went silent. I took a deep breath. The creek that was destroyed without proper permits has been on my family's property for generations. My grandchildren were supposed to play there just like my children did. "What would you have done if someone took something precious from you?" I asked the crowd. Catherine Reynolds, sitting away from her husband, nodded slightly. The voting began. People marked their ballots in small booths we'd set up. I caught Reynolds watching me, his eyes narrow with hatred. For a moment, I wondered if this fight had been worth it. The stress, the threats, the division in our once peaceful neighborhood. 2 hours later, the results were announced. Trevor would be president, with me as environmental committee chair. Reynolds stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The victory felt hollow amid so much bitterness. "First order of business," Trevor announced. "Filing formal charges against Quinn Development for environmental violations and restoring the creek." The room erupted in applause. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., my security system alerted me to movement in my yard. Through the window, I spotted a dark figure near my garage. I called the police, then cautiously went to investigate. It was Reynolds, spray paint can in hand, writing "traitor" across my garage door. When police arrived, they found more than just vandalism supplies in his car. There were printouts of everyone who had opposed him, with detailed notes about their violations he planned to use against them. News of Reynolds' arrest spread quickly. The local paper ran the headline, "HOA President Arrested. Corruption and Vandalism in Pine Haven Meadows." Quinn Development issued a statement denying any wrongdoing, but anonymous sources within the company began leaking emails that suggested otherwise. The trucks moved out the next day, but not before delivering materials for our creek restoration project. My cousin Derek brought his whole crew to help. "On the house," he said. "This story's too good not to be part of." Neighbors I'd never spoken to showed up with shovels and work gloves. Even Elaine Walker, Reynolds' former ally, came by with sandwiches for the volunteers. "I bought into his vision of perfect property values," she confessed as we watched children placing river rocks along what would become the creek bed. "I never stopped to think about what makes a neighborhood valuable in the first place." Catherine approached me while I was taking a water break. Her eyes were tired, but clear. "I'm filing for divorce," she said simply. This whole mess made me realize how controlling James has been, not just with the neighborhood, but with me. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "I'd like to help with the restoration," she added. "I used to be an environmental science teacher before James thought it wasn't prestigious enough." Over the next few months, the transformation was remarkable. Not just of the land, but of the people. Former enemies worked side by side. The creek began to flow again, clearer and stronger than before. Wildlife returned, first insects, then frogs, eventually birds who hadn't been seen in years. Reynolds pled guilty to vandalism and harassment charges. As part of his plea deal, he had to sell his house and move away from Pine Haven Meadows. No one was sad to see the moving truck. Quinn Development faced hefty fines for environmental violations. Their proposed development project was canceled after losing county approval. The land they'd purchased was eventually donated to a conservation trust, a far cry from the luxury condos they planned. 6 months after the election, we held a grand opening for what we now called Community Creek Park. Children ran along the banks of the restored waterway while parents chatted on new benches. A small exhibit explained the watershed's importance and how it connected to the larger river system. Catherine, now using her maiden name Wilson, cut the ribbon. She'd become the neighborhood's unofficial environmental educator, leading creek exploration days for local kids. "Looking at all this," she said, gesturing to the thriving green space, "it's hard to believe James wanted to bury it under rocks and mulch." Trevor approached with a group of visitors, county officials interested in using our restoration project as a model for other communities. "Your trucks caused quite a stir," one commissioner told me. "But sometimes people need a wake-up call." As the celebration continued, I wandered down to a quiet spot by the creek. The water burbled over stones, creating that peaceful sound I'd missed so badly. A small group of children were carefully catching and releasing tadpoles under Catherine's watchful eye. "My grandpa says you saved the creek," a little boy said, looking up at me with curious eyes. "We all saved it," I replied. "Sometimes you have to stand up for what matters." That evening, as the party wound down, I found myself sitting with Trevor and Catherine on a bench overlooking the water. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Trevor asked. I shook my head. I was just angry about my creek. I never thought about starting a movement. "That's how change happens," Catherine said softly. "One person gets pushed too far and stands their ground." As neighbors called their goodbyes, walking home along paths that connected our properties instead of dividing them, I realized something profound had shifted. My small act of rebellion with those trucks had cracked open something that had been building for years. Resentment, yes, but also a desire for genuine community. The next morning, I woke to the sound of water flowing and birds singing. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. The HOA still existed, but under Trevor's leadership, it focused on bringing people together rather than enforcing arbitrary rules. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the creek sparkle in the morning light, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Creek Cleanup Committee meeting today. Bring ideas and friends." I smiled. The battle that had started with blocked trucks and a buried creek had given us something none of us expected. A neighborhood that finally felt like home.